Translation is a form of magic. Fairytales and Us by Ruby-Clare. Translation in English is a global language. An estimated 1.5 billion people in the world speak English, according to Babbel.com, or about 20% of people in the world. So that's about 1 in 5 people. And while English is a global language, is primarily an effect of colonization, it has also made sharing stories from other cultures far more accessible to others. So English can dominate other cultures and other languages who don't have as many, supporters, don't have as much power, but it can. Classic European fairy tales. Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, that's just to name a few fairy tales that you may know. And translations made these fairy tales accessible to billions of people around the world, especially English speakers, because that's the most popular language to translate into. And English speakers, as I've said, make up 1/5 of the population. So that's a significant number of people. And fairy tales have been incorporated into entertainment, like films, songs, art, etc., and used in character education for young children, like in schools, learning about morals, learning from other people's mistakes that they make in these fairy tales. Film adaptations of classic fairy tales. On the slide, I have a few examples of popular movies that were created from fairy tales. They are all Disney movies, and from left to right, I have Cinderella, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Beauty and the Beast, and Maleficent. Although these movies are very popular in general, they are especially popular among children, probably because of how colorful they are, how they involve music sometimes, they're very extravagant, and children just like to read fairy tales in general. It lets them explore the world around them. So that's another way that fairy tales are incorporated into the lives of people all around the world, and children in particular. Fairy tales and nation language literature. When asked the question, what is English literature? Johnson 2012 responds, the answer to this deceptively simple question lies not in England, but in 18th century Germany, where an influential generation of philosophers insisted on the connection between the rise of modern national states, national languages, and national literatures. Page 180. This is important to note in relation to fairy tales, because fairy tales were, at least in Germany, a huge contribution to the creation of national literature, because they were stories from the folk, they were stories from the people who made up the nation. And so, since these were stories from the people, it created, the culture for what national literature was, especially for Germany, and that heavily influenced other nations to do the same. Many German fairy tales reflect societal norms at the time of their creation, such as not having enough food to take care of her children, like in Hansel and Gretel, or prevailing over those stronger than you as the underdog, like in The Brave Little Tailor. This is especially important to note because a lot of these fairy tales were created, or at least collected, during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, where a lot of German people were very poor. Their land was taken from them, and they didn't have much to fight back with. Through translating these fairy tales, we get an opportunity to understand the history and culture related to where they came from. And understanding the history and culture of others creates a stronger sense of respect for one another as a global community. Because when we get to know one another better, we get along better as a whole. I feel like we respect one another better when we understand where those stories come from. Fairy tales and nation language literature continued. According to Dollar 1995, the emergence of the literary fairy tale genre is an early, perhaps even the earliest situation in which translations create, influence, and promote national literary output, for the simple reason that the genre was considered primarily as literature for children who would be unfamiliar with foreign languages. Page 102. We have fairy tales, and especially translations of fairy tales, to thank for the popularization of national literature, like I said in the previous slide, as they were the main contributions to German national literature during the Romantic era and influenced other nations to do the same, like in Denmark and like with Hans Christian Andersen, as pictured here. Is often used in school as a way to learn how to become a good citizen. Can also be a form of bringing people together, and you'll see that in my presentation. How tales impact children continued. Characters facing frightening situations model coping skills for child readers, providing them with a dress rehearsal for life's challenges. DeWan, 2016, page 28. Translating these tales, particularly into English, brings them to a larger audience, since, as I've said before, English is an extremely prolific language and 20% of the world's population speaks English. This means that more children will be able to benefit from learning similar coping skills and be able to relate to one another more because of it. So if we think about all of the children that grow up reading these tales or hearing them, or even the people who are learning English as a second language in school, they probably come into contact with these tales as well. And if we all learn the same coping skills from these tales, when we come together, we'll be able to support one another more because we have this similar shared experience. Collective unconscious and its influence. Because of the popularity of these classic fairy tales among children for more than the past 2 centuries at least, they have contributed to the creation of a collective unconscious. Basically, that means that since we've all grown up with these tales, we have it in our mind how to act because of what we've learned from them and morals that we've learned from them, and especially since it's been for at least the past 200 years, those thoughts have been passed down through us. It is no coincidence that in Harry Potter one can find allusions to many heroes mentioned in other novels of the fantasy genre, such as The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. It can be explained by the fact that the authors who grew up on the same fairy tales have a collective unconscious, according to Carl Jung. Isina, 2013, page 165. And as I've said, so many people grow up with these fairy tales, with these stories and experiences. This collective unconscious spans across, everybody who has learned these tales. And obviously it even influences the creation of new stories like Harry Potter, which in turn influences the next generation of children who grow up reading Harry Potter. Downsides to translating fairy tales. As stated by After 2006, cast as an act of love and as an act of disruption, translation becomes a means of repositioning the subject in the world and in history. Page 6. Translating can take a culturally and historically relevant tale out of context and leave it totally misunderstood. The hegemony of the English language, meaning the dominance of the English language over minority languages and cultures, also makes it more difficult for non-European tales, and especially tales from minority languages and cultures, to gain recognition and become influential, like classic European folk tales have become influential. Here I have pictured Nabulela, which is a South African folktale, as well as a picture from Stories the Iroquois Tell Their Children by Mabel Powers, and the tale is called How Morning Star Lost Her Fish. These are obviously two tales that probably not a lot of us have heard of, if any of us have heard of. But these tales were told among people just like, Sleeping Beauty was told among people at the time of its creation. And taking a story out of context, linguistically, when we translate it, also takes it out of context culturally, since culture is tied to language so much. Conclusion. We've been able to engage with one another and people from all around the world thanks to the ability to translate, especially into English, because of its reputation as a global language. Fairy tales contributed to the creation of national literature in Germany and influenced other countries to produce their own national literary canon as well. Because fairy tales were well suited for children in terms of character development and exploration of the world, it was often translated because of children's lack of foreign language skills, hence the distribution of fairy tales to children all around the world. Conclusion continued. The impact of those tales has created a collective unconscious that influences the creation of more literary works that include fairy tale aspects, like in Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Star Wars. Although the use of the English language around the world is tied to colonization and dominance over minority languages and cultures, its widespread nature and the ability to translate have allowed us to connect to one another through childhood experiences like reading fairy tales, learning about fairy tales in school, learning about fairy tales when learning English as a foreign language, and coming into contact with movies and books heavily influenced by those fairy tales. We can't deny the impact that fairy tales have had through the centuries, and I hope that you can now better recognize its importance. We have English and English translation to thank for this, and although there are obvious downsides to English as a global language, I hope you can see through this presentation how it has helped bring people together and understand one another better as well. Thank you.